Hi everyone, and welcome to the Jeff Bullis Show. Today I have with me John Warrillow. Now he's the founder of the Value Builder System. Now I initially heard of John because I downloaded his book a few years ago called Built to Sell. And it's a fascinating book, and he's got a new book coming out, The Art of Selling Your Business. So it's really about, and I think a lot of the conversation we'll have today is about the art of being the entrepreneur, right from building the business to exiting the business. Just a little bit more about John. Basically, the Value Builder System is a simple software for building the value of a company used by thousands of businesses worldwide. It's offered by a global network of independent advisors known as Certified Value Builders. The Value Builder System incorporates several diagnostic tools, including the Value Builder Score. These businesses that achieve a Value Builder score of 90 or greater are worth double the average performing businesses. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to want to discover a bit more about that. His best-selling book, written around 2011, which I would highly recommend, Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You. That sounds fabulous to me. And I've been trying to do that for quite a few years, and it mostly has worked. John is the host of Built to Sell Radio, ranked by Forbes one of the world's 10 best podcasts for business owners. And so here is a podcast owner on a podcast. That's really nice, isn't it? So in 2015, John wrote another best-selling book, The Automatic Customer, Creating a Subscription Business in Any Industry, which is another area of interest to myself personally. And he started and exited 4 companies, and including one acquired by a public company. And he lives with his family in Toronto, and you can see by the scenery behind him that it's dark over there because it's now officially winter. And you can see, I think you're wearing a hoodie, and I'm wearing a sort of a short sleeve shirt. You know, so
don't rub it in, Billis.
Yeah. So it's really such a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm sure we're going to dive into a few interesting areas. Welcome.
I hope so. It's
Right,
great to be with you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So, all right. So let's sort of go back in time, and what got you into being an entrepreneur? It's a question I ask many of my guests, but how did it all start? Was it, were your parents entrepreneurs? Was it you just hated authority and didn't like working for anyone? Hated going to a big office tower? Tell me how it all started.
It's funny, my dad was a corporate guy. He worked in a big company, but I think he always was a little jealous of entrepreneurs, the freedom that entrepreneurs seem to have. And I think secretly he wanted me to be an entrepreneur because he exposed me to stuff. He was involved in magazine publishing, and they published and sponsored an event for entrepreneurs. So when I was about 17 or 18, starting to figure out the world, trying to figure out where I was going to go, what I was going to do, he took me to this big annual black tie event that was for celebrating entrepreneurs. And I just fell in love with these stories. These were the best entrepreneurs in the country, and they just had these incredible rags to riches stories. And I think in a funny way that's where the spark sort of started. And then, I had a job after uni, but it didn't last very long. I started a company after that, and haven't had a real job for a while. So I should thank my dad. I haven't done that. I haven't said directly that I don't know. I should sit him down and ask him, were you somehow in the background trying to manipulate things, my career choice? But I should thank him because it left a big mark on me, a big impression.
Well, maybe he was just basically trying to live his life through you by promoting you to be an entrepreneur. Maybe it's, who knows?
Get out of the house. Go. Leave, please.
Well, I think that's a lot of parents are trying to do
Yeah.
And I think it's a parent's job is to make the children slightly uncomfortable so they do leave.
That's true.
And, let them into the wild. I know I certainly, it's one of my tactics, and it seems to work generally quite well.
Well, you Aussies are good because you're known for having the walkabout, right? I mean, everybody leaves for a year, and you kind of force everybody to go to Whistler and be a lifty for a while or do whatever you do. And that's kind of part of the DNA of the Australian sort of culture, isn't it?
It is very much. Yeah, we a lot of the children, a lot of teenagers, once they leave university, take some do it before they sort of start their course. Some do it as a gap year, I suppose. And because Australia's a long way from anywhere, we're not quite sure what the rest of the world looks like. We've seen, things about Hollywood, and we've seen, Europe and Paris, and they're like these mythical places that attract us. So I think Australians have got the highest, one of the highest ownership per capita of passports. I think the English lead. But I think Australians are number 2 or something. So, and the Americans are actually one of the lowest in the whole OECD, apparently. So, anyway, there's a bit of useless information for you. So, yeah. But so you did uni, and what did you study?
Oh, I screwed up. I was sort of enamored by going to this university that my sister had gone to. It's called Queen's University, kind of popular. And I couldn't get into the business school. It had astronomical grades, and my grades weren't great. And so I chose communications, and it was this terrible program that was run by this really left-leaning professor, sort of, real socialist, and it was just terrible. And from the moment I got there, I go, what have I done? This mistake. And I was supposed to be there for 4 years. I left after 3. I never got my full degree as a result of that. What they call it, what is it called? A bachelor's degree. But big mistake. And it's funny because my kids now are getting the age where they're starting to think about university. And I find myself trying to just will them not to make the same mistakes that I made. I'm like, pick something you're interested in studying, not, because you've heard this school is good or that you think that the reputation of the school, et cetera. Just find something you like and you're passionate about.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's, and I went through a journey where I decided I wanted to be a doctor. That never happened because I hated the sight of blood, so obviously that wasn't going to work. Then I decided I wanted to be trained as an accountant, so and I hate detail. I'm not an attention to detail
What
guy.
were you thinking?
I don't know. I wasn't, frankly. And then I became a teacher, and then and I discovered at my first prac teaching session it should have been, a warning sign that it was like herding cats. And I should have done right control 101 instead of psychology 101 because teenagers are essentially just full of hormones, don't want to behave, they're testing limits, and right control would be a better skill essentially in a high school. So I hated it, frankly. So the reality is it took me a while to discover something I loved. So technology, sales and marketing is where I eventually ended up, and have never really left. So apart from a couple of little distractions, but you hit the nail on the head. I think that doing something you love, and I think have some innate ability is the best place to start. And yet quite often our parents in the past have told us take the safe job, so tell me more about how did you discover what you love doing, and maybe what you were good at. So obviously that's how you arrived here today. So tell us how you discovered that.
Yeah, it's funny. I went to work out of university. I went to work at a radio station, and I had an idea for a show, which ironically is sort of like your podcast. It was to interview entrepreneurs and ask them about their story and what they might do differently if they had it to do all over again. And I pitched this and in part it was inspired by that conference that I went to with my dad, hearing these stories. And I pitched it to the station. They said it would never work. Forget it. And I said, to hell with you. I'm going to go do it myself. So I left. And I pitched it to a syndication company, a company that sort of puts these shows nationally, syndicated, gets different stations locally to pick them up. This is 25 years ago. And in any case, we got it syndicated across the country in Canada. It was called Today's Entrepreneur. And literally, I'd interview a different entrepreneur every day and said, if you had it to do all over again, what would you do differently? And it's funny how things fall in full circle, because now I do this podcast and it's essentially the same thing 25 years later. There's a bit of, stuff that I've done in the meantime, but the show sort of was an inspiration. We did 3 years of the show, did a different entrepreneur every day. So it lasted 3 years. I started to build up this sort of understanding of how entrepreneurs think because I was interviewing them all. And then I started to work with big companies, banks, phone companies. Telstra was a client. the big sort of telcos and technology companies and help them market to SMB, the small medium business market, or in Australia you would call them SMEs, but in any event, these smaller companies. And that parlayed into a market research company that I ultimately built and sold to a public company, and took some time off and then started Value Builder after that. So that's a 25-year journey, but that the entrepreneur has been the sort of kernel or seed that sort of seems to weave through all those endeavors.
Yeah. So, and obviously you wanted to, and I came across a great quote by Wayne Dyer the other day, which is, teach yourself and then teach others and raise the energy of the planet. And I think, wow, that's just quote. That's just it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And obviously you're doing that. You went and taught yourself, then taught others, and you obviously are raising, the energy of the planet. So you're doing this, and you came to write your first book, which is Built to Sell. Is that your first book?
It was, yeah. Well, I wrote a book for my former company, but it was unrelated. Built to Sell was the first in the trilogy that makes up the kind of box set for entrepreneurs. So yeah, it was the first book for entrepreneurs.
So let's just take a bit of a dive into Built to Sell.
Sure.
So, and let's maybe distill it into, I suppose, the major components. It might be the best way to do it, so we can, I suppose, simplify what it's about. So Built to Sell, what's the first step that you think is important in a Built to Sell model?
Yeah, so I think it's a philosophy that you're trying to raise a child to become an independent adult. Think about, as a parent, your goal is to have the kids leave the nest and be able to kind of go and contribute to the world. In the same way, I think a Built to Sell company is being nurtured by the founder to create something that can go on and live without them. Yep. So that's the essence of a Built to Sell company, that it would exist or could exist without the owner. And that gives you, the owner, the ultimate poker hand, right? You can sell it if you want to, because it can thrive without you, but you could also, install a general manager and just make it a passive income thing. You could sell half of it to a private equity group and keep half of it. Like, there's lots of options if it can run without you. And then if it can't, it's really just a job. And that's the polar opposite of a Built to Sell company, when it really depends on you to do the work. And so that's the philosophy about Built to Sell, is really to create a company that thrives without you, essentially.
Love it. That's the underlying foundation, obviously, of Built to Sell company. So, writing a book obviously is a challenge. So, if you're going to sort of distill Built to Sell book into maybe 4 or 5 steps, so you basically want to create something that can live without you, that can.
Yeah.
So, what's the first step in the thinking, building a company to sell?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is the most counterintuitive thing you can possibly imagine as an entrepreneur, because as an entrepreneur, you grow up and the idea is sell, right? Cash flow, find something that someone will buy, basically, is the early days of a business. But once you build it to a certain point where it's sort of up on its knees and is starting to crawl, you need to actually sell less. And here's the reason: because when you sell a broad list of products and services, it's very difficult to get employees to do any of the work. You're a mile wide and an inch deep, and therefore employees can't really follow your speed. And as a result, most of the business falls back on your shoulders, because you can't train anybody to do the work. And so the opposite is to find something that meets the trifecta of scale, which is teachable, valuable, repeatable, meaning you've got to go through all the products and services that you sell today and say, okay, what of this hodgepodge menu of items can I teach employees to deliver? They're valuable, valuable to customers, and are reliable or repeatable, They're things that customers need to buy on a regular cadence. And so that's the first step, is to actually winnow down the list of things that you offer to just the things that meet that trifecta of scale: teachable, valuable, repeatable.
I love that's really, really cool. So teachable, valuable, repeatable. So, and I totally agree with you. I sort of come up as an entrepreneur, come up with a lot of ideas, and we offer a range of different things we sell. And going, uh, okay, so I, and if I want to be doing it myself all the time, well, it's just not going to scale, is it? So, because you've only got so much time in a day. So I think having a lot of ideas and going, okay, what's the one thing we're selling, or what are the two or three things we're selling, which is essentially what you're saying, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, it's that's the first step. And for a lot of us, it's the hardest step because it requires so much discipline to say no. But a funny thing happens, I have found, and I'd be curious to know if this has happened to you. When you start saying no and you say, we're actually not in that business, we're really specialist in this business over here, all of a sudden you become infinitely more referable because as an expert in one thing, it becomes easier to refer you to friends or family. Your customers make it a lot easier for you to refer you. If you're just a generalist, oh, he's an accountant, she's a window cleaner, he does architecture. It's just very difficult to refer you because you're just not an expert or a specialist or a guru in any one space. But if you're an architect who specializes in building museums, guess what? When you hear someone needs a museum designed, you're going to go, oh yeah, I remember there's a guy that does exactly that. And it just makes you that much more referable. So although it feels wrong to be specializing, it actually is, I think, the raw material to create the kind of flywheel of word of mouth that so many of us rely on. It's when you become that specialist, niched down, that you really start to pick up some more word of mouth.
So what you're essentially saying is instead of an inch wide and a mile wide and an inch deep, it's the other way around. It's a mile deep and an inch wide. Okay, so you've got that emerging. It's crawling now. So what's the next, this beautiful child that you're trying to nurture so it can leave? So what's the next step after that?
I think the next step is to create recurring revenue. And that's why the R in the TVR model is so important, because you have to find a product or service that customers have an ongoing need for. And once you do that, it really comes down to creating some sort of subscription, annuity, service contract, something that takes you out of the transaction business model where you've got to stimulate demand and fulfill demand, et cetera, to the automatic customer model, which is where you have customers that are paying you on a recurring basis for a set of solutions, a set of offerings that they have to opt out of as opposed to opting into. Right. And that's really the essence of a recurring business model. And it's been, obviously, anyone who buys software these days, you're buying it on recurring models. But now the savviest, I think, entrepreneurs, and those certainly that want to build a company that can thrive without them, are turning just about any business these days into a recurring revenue model. And I think that's the second step in this process is create some automatic revenue that gives you that base of sustainable revenue, the foundation to pay your ongoing expenses, onto which you can then start to expand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that your book, The Automatic Customer, which I haven't read, but I have downloaded. I'm certainly going to dive into that more. But yeah, creating something that, and the challenge too, you just go to unsubscribe. Let's try and unsubscribe from an Apple subscription, for example. Good luck with that. Trying to find the unsubscribe button in Apple is a challenge in its own right. So, in other words, I've got to opt out of, not opt into. So you've built this recurring business model. What are the challenges up? What's the next step after that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about a recurring revenue model, in particular a subscription model, that you need to think very carefully about is that all of a sudden your cash flow can become compromised, because instead of getting 100% of what you sell up front, which is the way we buy most products, when you're buying a subscription, you're buying it on a tiny little slice every month for a long, long time. So over the lifetime value of that customer, that subscriber, you're bound to get more money from them in most cases, but up front, you're usually getting less money. You know, when you sell in the old days, you used to go to Staples. I'm not sure what it is in Australia, but a big box retail store, and you bought a box of Microsoft Office off the shelf, right? And you install the CDs into the computer, and there you go. You spend $400 on the CDs, and you have it for life. It's been perpetuity, right? Of course, nowadays we all subscribe to Office 365 or whatever it is, and you pay a little bit of money, but you pay it every year. And over the lifetime, Microsoft gets more money out of you, but in the short term, they get less money. And so that's a real head scratcher for a lot of entrepreneurs. And so what we need to do is think through the cash flow model. And in particular, what I would recommend in most cases is to find a way to bill for at least a big portion of your subscription up front. It's one of the other drivers of the value of your company is what we call the cash flow seesaw or teeter-totter in America, where the value of your company goes up, the more cash you can accumulate and spit off. And so again, when you create your subscription model, think about, is there a way that I can get customers to pay up front for a significant portion? Because that does two things. Number one, it makes them stickier, and it gives you cash flow up front, because it makes them stickier because they make more of an investment with you when they start with you. And that makes them more likely to bet in and learn and onboard and ultimately stay with you longer.
That's a great idea. In other words, sell, instead of just a monthly subscription, sell an upfront for 1 year and give them a substantial discount for buying that. And that would give you a bigger chunk of money.
Yeah. And as well, if you can get them to buy, in a software case, you get them to buy like an installation package or an upfront training program where they're making a significant financial investment to use the product in the first place. Again, that helps you two ways. Number one, the cash flow, but number two, because they're making that big upfront investment, they tend to pay more attention to the onboarding. And the thing that is most predictive of the retention rate of a subscriber is the first 30 days of their relationship with you. It's called the onboarding window. And if you as a vendor, as an entrepreneur, can nail that first 30 days, doesn't matter what you're selling, could be window cleaning services, could be a software program, doesn't matter. If you make sure that first 30 days of a customer relationship as a subscriber is amazing, their likelihood to stay with you is almost infinite. And the opposite is not true. If you drop the ball in the first 30 days, no matter how good you are after that, their likelihood to attrite goes up. Their likelihood to leave you is much, much higher if you bobble the ball in the first 30 days. So if there's any place in the subscription relationship to really focus on, it's that first 30 days. That's going to be predictive of how long they stay with you.
Yeah, because one of the biggest issues with subscription is churn. And what you've talked about is something that will minimize churn by, we could use the old chestnut, under promise and over deliver, which is essentially what you're saying, isn't it? So give us some examples of that. Let's say someone signs up to a education type program. They spend $50 a month. We got the likes of Digital Marketer does this. So what were some of the things you would do in the first 30 days to make sure that they're just going, wow, this is so cool? What are some tactics?
Let me give you a real life example, because it's in the book that you referenced, Automatic Customer, and I think it is a really kind of illustrative example of bad onboarding versus good onboarding. The company is Constant Contact. You know Constant Contact? I'm imagining you know those guys. Gail Goodman was the CEO at the time, and they used to be run by a bunch of engineers. And so when people signed up for Constant Contact service, they took a who, what, when approach to onboarding, meaning the first thing they prompted you to do once you'd sign up for a free Constant Contact or 30-day trial or whatever, they say, great, we're going to help you send an email to your customers and prospects. Who do you want to send it to? Because they were engineers thinking in a very linear fashion. The challenge with that Goodman found was that the uploading of a CSV file and trying to match the fields was quite complicated for most entrepreneurs. Most entrepreneurs are not tech savvy, and certainly most retail business owners are kind of dumbfounded by this idea of like uploading a CSV file and trying to match the columns and the rows, and they'd bail on it, right? Right in the first kind of hour or two of using the software, they'd say, to hell with this is way too complicated. And they'd bail, and they had an astronomical churn rate in their trial period. And so Goodman retooled and worked with the engineers and said, you know what, guys, we got to think about this differently. We got to think more creatively about the onboarding process. What if we take a what, who, when approach to onboarding? In other words, instead of asking them to upload their CSV file, why don't we have them design their first email? Right? If you're a flower shop, we've got all these templates of visuals of pictures you can use of flower shops. And all of a sudden, the business owner is like importing a picture and it looks beautiful and they're putting their name and they're writing their email and it's all becoming on screen for them and it's kind of coming to life for them. And they're becoming more and more emotionally attached to both the software and the idea of sending that email, right? And once they'd created a draft of the email, only then did Goodman say, okay, guys, now step 2 is we got to figure out who to send this to, right? And this is kind of a kludgy, messy process. You've got to upload this thing. We can help you. Here's our 800 number. But by that time, they had the intestinal fortitude, the equity, the investment in the relationship to get over this speed bump associated with uploading the CSV file. And so again, this may sound really trivial as an example, but it's the kind of choreographing that smart companies think about when it comes to onboarding. It's that level of detail so that you can really nail the customer experience up front. Long story short, Goodman nailed that form of onboarding, dropped her churn rates, ultimately became a very successful company as a result.
Yeah, that's a really great example. There's maybe something that's associated with that called the Ikea Effect, which is essentially getting someone to put something together, which is what you've really described with an email using a template. And the IKEA effect is that the customers are so embedded with the product because they need to put it together.
Yes.
So
and they have the pride of creation, I guess, on some level. Although, God help me if I have to put another IKEA furniture together.
Yeah. Well, it worked to a point, and I've tried to avoid it ever since. Especially when
I turned 30.
Yeah, that's right. I'd put a double bunk together and I had panels down the wrong way and it's like disassemble, then assemble again. It's like, shoot me. That's really what I thought at the end of that time. So, all right. So we've get the onboarding and we're having a positive experience. We've overpromised, over-delivered, under-promised. They're happy. You've got the first 30 days nailed. Okay. So what are some of the steps after that you see as we need to have a closer look at?
Yeah, you mean in terms of building a valuable company, building a built-to-sell company? Yeah, I mean, one of the other things is what we call the Switzerland structure. So once you build this company up, what you've got to make sure is you do what investors call de-risking. It sounds like such a pretentious kind of financial geek kind of term, but effectively when an acquirer wants to buy your business, one of the things that they are evaluating is the level of risk, right? The more risk, the lower the value they're going to place on your business. So you want to de-risk it for them and then jack up the value of your company in their eyes. And one of the ways you de-risk it is you focus on the Switzerland structure, which is inspired by the country of Switzerland, which, as you know, is sort of like this butt of a lot of jokes because they never take sides, right? They, the world wars can be breaking out, around them and they choose not to pick a side, right? Because they're trying to be Switzerland. And so the same is true of the most valuable companies. They remain Switzerland, meaning not dependent or not too cozy to any one customer, employee, or supplier. That's the three constituencies, the legs of the stool of the Switzerland structure, where you find that a lot of companies become really dependent on a single customer, a single supplier, or a key employee. And what you've got to do at this process, especially when you're starting to think about, hey, maybe I can sell this business or juice its value up to the point where I could sell it, you want to make sure that you're independent of any of those three groups. So customer diversity, you really want to make sure no one customer or client makes up more than, say, 10 or 15% of your revenue. Equally, suppliers, if you're getting all of your supply from one company, it can be a problem because that company could go out of business, change its model, et cetera. And the same token, you want to make sure that you're not overly dependent on one employee because obviously an acquirer is going to look at that as a potential liability.
Yeah, I'd really like that. I do know I was on the board of a company recently and we were very dependent upon Facebook for 80% of our revenue, which worried me a lot.
They changed the algorithm, they changed the pricing model, they changed any number of things.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and what we did is we did spread the risk right around now, took it to a much more direct business model. and deal with a whole range of different markets where we aren't dependent on just one customer.
That's fantastic.
Which is really, really good. So the Switzerland effect model. So what's the next step after that you think is really, really important?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think you've probably got a built to sell company. You're selling a few things. You can get other people to do the work. You're building it on a recurring model. So it's, customers are coming in on a recurring cadence. You're nailing the onboarding period. So you're reducing churn, and you've got, an independent model. So it's not dependent on you. At that point, I think you've got the essence or the raw material for a built to sell company.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you probably want to start having these conversations in your mind about, what do I want to do next? Do I want to harvest the value of this company?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In other words, ultimately sell it, or do I want to just continue to grow the business in perpetuity? Am I happy doing that? And you may decide that you are. One of the things that I talk a lot about, and maybe Jeff, you've done some of the same thinking on your end. There's this thing called the freedom point, where a lot of entrepreneurs will wake up and they will say, in a cold sweat, oftentimes they will say, hang on a minute. If I sell this company, it would actually give me enough money to live for the rest of my life. I don't actually have to work again. And when you have that realization, first of all, it can be incredibly rewarding to have that realization. The second thing that happens oftentimes is the thought that, oh my gosh, every day I keep my business, I'm like a gambling poker addict at the table in Las Vegas, putting all the chips in the middle of the table, because I've essentially created what I was aspiring to create, which is freedom, right? Is the ultimate freedom, is the ultimate, what for most entrepreneurs, what they're craving. And every day I continue to own that company, I'm risking that freedom, because as we've seen in this pandemic, anything can happen. There's always a black swan event around the corner. And if you don't monetize what you've created, you're effectively all in all the time.
Yeah.
And for a lot of entrepreneurs, when they start their business, it's like nothing, 0% of their net worth, right? It's an idea for most of us, and it's not worth anything. But if you reach a point where it is a viable, ongoing business, it can become quite quickly a huge proportion of your net worth. And we think about diversity in our personal lives, right? You don't buy all one stock in your stock market, but when it comes to your business, effectively your net worth could be, 50, 60, 70, 80% of your net worth could be in this one asset. That's when, we start to think about, well, maybe it makes sense to harvest some of what you've created by selling either all or, part of what you've built.
Yeah. So that's a great segue then to go to, all right, you've built to sell. You've had this aha moment, and you're going, gee, I've got almost all my personal wealth tied up in this one, business or one asset. A black swan event. Well, we've had one of these, this year.
Yeah.
So, and so it's a big risk. Some people go down the route too. They sell it and they go, what do I do next? And they lose purpose. They're going, I've arrived, right? I've got all this money in the bank. And they realize, well, I haven't arrived. I'm lost. I've seen that with a few people over the last few years. And it's like, okay, you never arrive. It's just the journey which you want to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyway, that's a little segue, but let's just dive on to the next part, which I find fascinating, which is a topic of your new book, which, when's it coming out? Is it January?
Comes out January 12th.
Okay,
yeah,
right.
2021. So in about, few days after we record this.
So let's look under the covers and see what maybe is going to emerge from that in January. So you've built the business, built it to sell. Now it's the art of selling. Mm-hmm. Tell us where that starts, some of the key steps in the art of selling.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think acknowledging that it is an art, not a science. You know, it's tempting. There's a whole raft of valuation consultants and accountants that will claim to be able to put a value on your company. And I always sort of smile because it's an estimate of value, right? Because really, value, the ultimate arbiter of value is going to be the acquirer, right? They're going to view your business and they're going to come up in their own mind about what they think it's worth. And so there's an art, as much as it's a science, there's a bigger portion of it, I think, which is an art, which is projecting what it would feel like for an acquirer to own your company. And so I think there's an overlying sort of arc, which is that this is at least half an art form of promoting this business and making it a successful transaction for you. In the book, I did for the podcast, I do an interview with a different entrepreneur every week. I've been doing it for 5 years, so we're up to something like 300 interviews now. And I tried to curate the best ideas for selling a company, the best strategies, the best hacks, the best negotiation sort of tips I could come up with, and put them into the book. So that's really, it's a distillation of those interviews that have been so helpful for me personally, and have kind of formed what is in the book.
Right. So you're trying to make the company look as, I suppose, as positive as possible, but from a much more a psychological point of view than just necessarily a nuts and bolts, like it's, you know, it's going to be worth 10x, you know, annual revenue, or 20x in profit, whatever. So what are some of the psychology that you discovered works well? Is it painting the dream of what they're going to get from buying this business? It's going to take them to the next level. Tell us a little bit more about the art side.
Yeah. Do you ever read, and this is an old book, I think it's a brilliant book. Do you ever read Reese and Trout, The Art of Positioning? Reese and Trout did, no, it's not The Art of Positioning. The Battle for Your Mind. Do you remember that book? 1970s. It's a long time.
So the author, Reese and Trout, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Al Reese, Jack Trout.
Yep.
I can't remember the name.
I can't remember the name of it,
but it's the best. I mean, you could just Google Reese and Trout marketing positioning and you'd come up with it in a second. But it's the best book I've ever read on the art of positioning a product. And they talked about the launch of Miller Lite beer and the way they positioned it, which was everything you've always wanted a beer and less. Because what they were doing was taking all the mental synapses in the brain around a beer. It's something that everybody knows what it is. Everybody knows what it tastes like. Everybody knows what it feels like to have a cold, frosty mug of beer in your hand. And they just put that very subtle twist and said, and less, because it was Miller Lite, it had less calories, et cetera. And what they were talking about was the art of positioning a product in a zone or a category that consumers already know and just placing a slight point of differentiation. The same is true when you go to sell your business, because acquirers, in particular strategic acquirers and private equity groups, they are inundated with people trying to get their attention. And so they use shortcuts as a way to filter out the best opportunities. And so one of the ways they do that is they have a kind of company in their mind that they want to go buy. And if you don't look like one of those, they're going to filter you out pretty quickly. I'll give you an example. There's one in the book where it's a guy named Feldberg who I interviewed, had a company called Embanet, and they helped universities and colleges put their content online, their courses online. And in the early days, they got an offer, which was a pretty classic offer for their company, of around 3 times profit. That was an acquisition offer. And for the acquirer making that offer, they saw Embanet as this little web design shop. And they figured that a web design shop with a couple of partners, maybe $1 million or $2 million in sales, was worth around 3 times EBITDA. What Feldberg did is he said, that's not enough. We are in this incredible burgeoning field of e-learning. And this is around the time that Lynda was acquired by LinkedIn.
Yes.
And everybody was all excited about e-learning. And so they made a change to the way they positioned their company. They went from positioning their business as a website design studio to a leader in the e-learning space. Well, long story short, a couple of years later, they got another acquisition offer. This time it was from a company that wanted to be in the e-learning space. they offered 13 times profit. So more than 4 times what they had originally been offered in terms of evaluation model. Now, it was a bigger company, it was a different business model, but in part, it was the way they were positioning their company. So that's just one of many sort of tips and tricks for how to maximize the value of your company when you go to harvest it, is you've got to look like something someone wants to buy. Acquirers have a list of the types of companies they want to buy, and you've got to fit into one of those categories, one of those buckets. And in the case of Embonet, they fit into the e-learning bucket, which is how they got such a high multiple.
That's very cool. I do like, so you're differentiating and trying to tap into something that's, I suppose, trending.
That's right.
And I have heard some, watched a TED Talk a while back, and they use 5 different key things to maximise or success for an entrepreneur or business. And number 1 was finding the right trend. It far surpassed even the funding, it surpassed the idea, but finding a niche that is trending. And I would totally agree with that. So
very important in the sale of a company as well.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I wanted to, I suppose a couple other things I wanted to touch on, and then we'll have a look maybe at the value builder system that intrigues me and how that works in terms of, wrapping up built to sell with the art of selling your business. So a lot of people, when they go to sell, the company's buying them, you want to de-risk it. One of them is a Switzerland model. The other one is that they want to see robust processes. Tell me a little bit, let's look at robust processes a little bit in terms of how valuable you think they are.
Yeah, no, I think they are incredibly valuable. Again, in part because a standard operating procedure or process, for our American listeners, is a way that your business can operate without you. And so what we talked about, a built to sell company is not dependent on its owner. One of the strategies is to sell less things to more people. Another strategy is to take the processes that you do in your company and document them and make them repeatable and share them with the people that you want to do the work. And again, this gives not only your business the ability to kind of thrive without you, and incredibly important, but it also gives an acquirer a sense that there is a thing behind this business. There's process, there's infrastructure. If you put yourself in the shoes of an acquirer, they are petrified that they're going to buy your company and you're going to walk out the door and they're not going to know how to run the thing. Imagine you get handed the keys to a car that you don't even know how to turn on, let alone drive or service, et cetera. And the same thing is true as acquirers. So when they see that you've documented your processes, that you built out a whole library, an operating manual, a handbook, it gives them an enormous sense of confidence that, hey, there's a recipe card here that we can follow. So I think that's a really important part of building a sellable company for sure. Yeah.
In other words, you are essentially building something that doesn't need you, because the challenge with a lot of businesses is that you want to buy the business, you don't want to buy the person who started the business, and that becomes a challenge, doesn't it? For me, jeffbullis.com is me. Yes, I built processes behind it, but there is a real challenge to making it so you're buying a system that is repeatable. And basically people can walk in, they can just turn up the volume, do more marketing, change the marketing, because the system is robust and works well. So tell us a little bit about, so we've got basically the art of selling your business. Okay, what's some of the, and you sort of touched on the art, what's some of the science of selling your business before we get into the value builder system?
Sure. Yeah. So we can talk a little bit about value builder. So yeah, it's a software system that is designed to help you improve the value of your company. It's dependent on 8 unique drivers or variables. We measure everybody who comes in and completes their value builder score, which is sort of like an intake questionnaire. It's about 40 questions that asks you about your business. Do you have recurring revenue? How dependent is the company on you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we do is give you a score. And the average performing business when they start with us gets a score of 59 out of 100. And those companies are trading at, getting offers of roughly 3.5 times pre-tax profit.
Mm-hmm.
Those companies that achieve a score of 90 or greater, so these are the kind of best in class, the all-stars, so to speak, they're getting offers of 7.1 times pre-tax profit, or more than double. So it's a system that's designed to, first of all, benchmark where you are, and then help you improve the value by thinking about moving these 8 levers effectively. So one of the 8 levers is recurring revenue. We've talked about that already. You've got to have more recurring revenue. Another is the Switzerland structure, making sure you're not dependent on any one customer, employer, or supplier. So there's these 8 levers you can kind of manipulate up and down, and it drives up the value of your company. If you can get your score to 90 out of a possible 100, while you've more than doubled your business value. One of the other things that I think, Jeff, is really aspirational and really attractive, I think, about Value Builder is that not only does a score of 90 improve the value of your company, it triples the likelihood that you're going to get an offer for your company. When we look at the average of our 55,000 users, about 13% of them have received an offer to buy their business. Yet if we look at the folks who score 90 or greater, almost 40% of them have received an offer to buy their business, almost 3 times more likely. And again, you may not want to sell your company, but I bet you'd want to be courted or get unsolicited offers, because that puts you in a negotiation leverage position, right? You've got total control at that point. You don't have to sell, but you can entertain an offer. And that's, I think, one of the true benefits of focusing on these 8 factors.
So how does a value builder system work? In other words, if someone wanted to, let's say, use the system, how does it work? What's sort of the pricing model? Tell us a little bit more about that. That would be interesting to the readers or listeners.
Yeah, well, it's always free to get started. So you can get your Value Builder score. You just go to valuebuilder.com and you can complete the questionnaire. When you do that, we'll invite you to connect with a certified Value Builder, which is one of the people around the world that have been licensed to use the system, to offer the system. So in Australia, we've got certified Value Builders in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and all over the Western Australia and Perth and so forth. And then there's people all over the world who offer the Value Builder system, and they will help you interpret your score. They'll give you your report out of a possible 100. And then if you want, you can engage them to help you go through the 12 steps in the Value Builder system, and they will take you through it. But again, it's free to get started, and then you can make the decision whether you want to go through the whole process with your certified Value Builder.
Okay. So you've built a really interesting model over the years that you've learned from, I suppose, hard work and challenge. What are some of the big challenges you've discovered as an entrepreneur that you've really struggled with personally?
Personally, I think I remember that radio show I was telling you about like 25 years ago I used to do. There was a guy named Greg Clark. He's probably dead now. I mean, this was years ago. I hope he's not dead. He was a great interview, but he was, this is going back 30 years. And I remember I said, what's the one thing that you wished someone had told you or done differently or whatever? And he said, you know what, John, I wished I'd not gotten so high on the highs and not gotten so low on the lows. And I've always remembered that quote because it resonated with me at the time. It still resonates with me today. I find that if I do one of my biggest mistakes is taking the business much, much too personally. And so as a result, when things go well, I am way too happy. And then when things don't go as well, I am really a bear to be around. And so I've always struggled to moderate my moods around the how things are going in the business. And so that's something I'm constantly working on. Even, to this day, I'm constantly trying to find more of a middle ground in terms of not getting too high on the highs and low on the lows. Again, I remember the quote like it's yesterday. And again, it must be almost 30 years ago that Greg shared that with me. So that's one of the things I personally struggle with. Yeah,
because and I've heard this over time as well with other entrepreneurs, is that and that book that was mentioned was The Hard Things About Hard Things.
Yeah, great book.
And so I think it's done by Horowitz. I think was Ben
Horowitz, I think is the name. Yeah.
And I would agree with you. Like, I've had some of my lowest moments in life, I think, when business has, like, businesses failed. Sometimes I've been just on an absolute boom for 2 years. As sales skyrocketed, and it's like it's like a drug.
Yeah.
But it's a real struggle to manage that. And so so just to wrap things up, then we've talked about the Built to Sell, which I think is a great book, and then you've got The Art of Selling. Then you've got the system that I suppose wraps those both. In other words, starting the business, building it, and then exiting. So, what are 2 or 3 things you could share with our listeners that you'd like them to go away with that you think is really, really important as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the key themes that transcends everything that I do is this idea that if you can build a company that can thrive without you, you have the ultimate control. You can create the life that you want to lead. You can continue to run your business knowing that it's not dependent on you, that it is a sellable asset if you ever choose to monetize it. And that's takes a different mindset. For many entrepreneurs, we grow up in entrepreneurship thinking that our profit and loss statement is our report card at the end of the year, right? Like, how do we do on our top line? How did the bottom line look? And in many cases, that's a false narrative, or it's a mirage, because if you can't build it that to a point where it doesn't depend on you, it's not very valuable, and it really can be really much less more of a job than a real kind of transferable asset. And I think that the mindset switch that I think is important, and I shared it in the very beginning of our conversation, is this idea of, instead of thinking about how do I make more money this year, or how do I make more revenue this year, think about how do I take this child, this adolescent that's kind of moving in all kinds of different directions, lots of adrenaline and testosterone, and how do I kind of get it to a point where he or she can sort of thrive on their own, right? It's just a different way to think about your role as an entrepreneur. You're kind of, it's the thought of being a parent to a business as opposed to kind of being the CEO of a business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think it's a great analogy you're using. That is you're essentially trying to nourish a child to grow up and leave.
Yeah.
And your job as a parent is not to have them dependent on you. Is your job as a parent, if done correctly, is that hopefully they can grow up and be independent enough to go out into the world, into the wild, and succeed. And
and I think if you talk to parents, I mean, you're a dad, there's nothing that gives a parent more pride than seeing their kid independently just, succeeding in the world, whatever they choose to do, fireman, lawyer, whatever. I mean, it doesn't matter what they're doing. They're independent. They are thriving without you. And I think the same is true, that feeling that you get from running a company that, oh my gosh, it's working without me. They're making sales, they're making widgets, they're shipping customers are happy, and I'm not doing anything. And that is an enormous sense of satisfaction for entrepreneurs. Whether you sell it or not is kind of gravy. It just gives you that enormous sense of pride of achievement that you built something, you created something that literally will perpetuate itself beyond you. And I think that's an amazing feeling.
Yeah, and I agree. When I built the podcast, yes, I have to do the doing in terms of the interview, but we have a system behind that I still do one other important part of it, which is to go through the transcript at the end, because for me, the journey, what's a very important part of the journey for me is to learn.
Got it.
So, and every opportunity I have to sit down and have a chat like we're having now, and dive into what you've learnt, I learn so much. You're teaching the listeners, and that gives me so much joy. Is that then we're raising the whole energy of the planet, and I think I used the term before: is teach yourself, teach others, and raise the energy of the planet. And
I love that expression.
Yeah. So it's become a little bit of a mantra the last few weeks, but I've done that in different ways. But what I love about the podcast now is I know the team can just deliver on it. I only have to do a couple of things. Number one, run the interview, upload the files at the end, and then do the transcript and the intro. Because the reason I want to do that is because I then have to distill 14,000 words or 15,000 words that have emerged from this conversation, and I'm going, wow, that is so cool. And for me, just the learning part. Look, and a lot of entrepreneurs think it's all about the money, and we know they get to a certain point where the money is, yes, long as it can pay for your life, long as it can give you freedom to, go to a restaurant or take a holiday. After a certain point, it becomes pointless.
That's right. Yeah.
And then the freedom then is the freedom that you have emotionally, intellectually, to do the things that you really, really love doing. And I think that's the other thing about being an entrepreneur, is that freedom comes with its responsibility, in that it can be painful, it can be hard. And I certainly see that as an entrepreneur, if you just get lost in the fact it's all about the money, well, it's pretty soulless. And it's got to be that balance between giving the freedom financially, maybe de-risking and selling it so that you can maybe move on to the next adventure.
Absolutely.
Because certainly selling your business is great, but if you've got nothing to do except just go to the golf course every day and buy tequila, in 6 months you are going to hate yourself.
Absolutely. And if I go back to the 300 or so people I've interviewed for Built to Sell Radio, I think virtually all of them have started another company. Yeah. It wasn't about retiring, as in a true sense of the word. It was they wanted to move on. They wanted to monetize what they created and go do something else. And I couldn't agree more.
So apart from exiting a business, just to finish things up, what's important to John?
Oh man, obviously I've referenced my kids throughout the conversation. So my family is hugely important. And I try to take some of the things that we've talked about today into my personal life. I just love being a dad and watching my kids grow up. And that takes up a lot of my time right now. So that's a pretty big deal.
So family brings you joy.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For sure.
Well, if you can raise a successful family, then maybe that is success.
The rest is gravy. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I agree.
All right, John, it's been an absolute pleasure. And,
me too. I've enjoyed this conversation for sure.
And we'll keep in touch, and I look forward to sharing this with my listeners. And I look forward to catching up in real life sometime when when 2020 event has or 2020 has passed, and when
we've all got the jab and we can get on with our lives.
we can get into a plane and go and explore the world and meet up with fabulous people. And I look forward to catching up in real life with you at some stage. And
I really like that.
You live in a beautiful country. I have had the pleasure of being in Canada, so I'd like to revisit it. Thanks very much, John. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, John.